Welcome everyone to the next in our series of Canadian Club of Rome Wednesday presentations from interesting people that have things that contribute or in experiences that can contribute to the ongoing task of CACOR. Today we have the Director of Stakeholder Engagement and Management with the National Research Council of Canada in the Construction Research Center. And this is Marianne Armstrong, and she has a presentation which is already on your screen, and I ask Marianne now to take over.
Sure, no problem. So thank you very much for inviting me today. You all know my dad. He's in one of the little pictures there, Ted Manning. Hi, Dad. But it's a pleasure to see you all today and to present. So before taking on the role right now of director, I was manager of the Climate Resilient Buildings and Core Public Infrastructure Initiative with NRC. This is one of the largest initiatives at NRC that I think we've ever had. So I'm very pleased to tell you about it. We're just finishing it up too, the first 5 years, and we hope to keep going. But there's a lot of good stuff coming out from what we're doing. So it's a pleasure to be able to share this with you today. So what I'll start with is a little bit about Canada's changing climate. Being the Canadian Club of Rome, I'm sure you're quite familiar with this, but I'll share a couple of tidbits of information about that. Then I'll go on to speak about our initiative, what we've been working on in terms of updating standards and guidelines relating to Canada's buildings and infrastructure, and talk more specifically about a few areas as well on flooding, wildland urban interface design, buildings, and infrastructure adaptation. All right, so hopefully you're familiar with it, and if not, please go check it out. Canada's Changing Climate Report came out just over a year ago. We've been working very closely with Environment and Climate Change Canada to develop the data that's needed by our people in this country who are designing buildings and infrastructure. It's the very same people who wrote this report. However, the data for us is a little bit more specific, and we'll get into why that's so in a second. But this report does give you a glimpse of what Canada is going to look like in the future, both whether we decide to mitigate and take enough action to mitigate to mean we don't need to adapt as readily, or some of the worst case scenarios as well, which I hope you probably, or I hope, but I know you probably find them quite alarming, as I do. So this is one of the examples that I like to show, particularly to international audiences who don't know the extent to which we're expecting Canada to be affected by climate change. Canada is warming at twice the global rate, obviously not evenly throughout. It's worse at the northern part of the country. And if we do fail to mitigate, this is what we could be looking at by the end of the century. You can see upwards of 10 degrees warming in the north of the country, which is immense and not something that we are by any means prepared for, and not something that's going to be easy to adapt to. So again, if we want to be able to adapt and afford to adapt, we need to mitigate. When we look at precipitation, warm air holds more water, but it doesn't follow any rules and it doesn't fall evenly. So even though we might be seeing more precipitation, we might see more in the winter, less in the summer, we might actually see more droughts towards the south of the country by the end of the century. And this one I find particularly interesting. We talk about climate change, we talk about sea level rise. And when we look at sea level rise, we think more ice melting, more the sea rises. The world doesn't quite work that way. And in fact, because the ice is melting, the continental shelf is actually rising to the north. And so we see the opposite effect to the northern parts of this country. Whereas on the coast, where we have the most people living, we are of course seeing sea level rise due to climate change, and that can be exacerbated by storm surge, which can be larger as well due to bigger storms. So something as well, we like to talk about climate change and extreme events. The linkages between extreme events and climate change require a lot of historic data to make them. So we're just starting to get evidence as how climate change relates to flooding. We have very good information on temperature, so we understand right now with climate change, we're risking some of these heat waves we see in the summer that are now maybe a once in 20-year event, might become a 1 in 2-year event by the end of the century. The same with rainfall, 1 in 20-year rainfall event could be a 1 in 10-year event in the worst case scenario. We also see, of course, increased risk of heat waves brings increased risk of drought and potential for wildfire risks. Flooding risks, we're just starting to get more information on how they might be affected by climate change and linked to climate change, mainly due to the fact we don't have a lot of historic data to base this information on. But we do understand that, again, warmer air has more energy, contains more water, can hold more water, so should theoretically lead to larger convective storms such as thunderstorms and more risks for urban floods and events like we just saw in Calgary. But that linkage, again, they need better models to be able to model it effectively. It's coming along. Give us 5-10 more years and we should have better models that can demonstrate how those storms are going to be changing in this country. And the final one that there's a more obvious link right now to climate change is snowmelt related flooding. So if we see earlier snowmelt, larger storms as well, so rain on snow events causing flooding, particularly in the Rocky region, so in Alberta, that's been linked. So how will this affect our built environment? And this is really the question that we set out to answer at the start of the project, was to understand what are the risks to our built environment and what can we do to mitigate those risks. So we're looking at extreme events like flooding, wildfire, wind events, heat waves, as well as the thawing permafrost in the north of the country, coastal flooding, and also maybe not as interesting right now when people think about the major events that cause a lot of damage and cost a lot of money, but the change in durability of materials and systems. For example, every time the temperature goes up, the rates of corrosion go up. So we need to understand how the durability of materials is going to be affected in future climates and be able to design for that. So this brings me to the project, and this is the main goal of the project, is to develop decision support tools like codes, guides, and models so that we can start designing new buildings and new infrastructure for climate change and extreme events, as well as retrofitting existing infrastructure and buildings. So we're working in a number of areas. One is to understand the climate data, the future climate. We're working on roads, buildings, bridges, water, wastewater, rail transit, as well as decision support tools, and that's primarily life cycle assessment. So we're trying to understand how climate change is actually going to affect the lifespan of our assets, and we'll have to fix them more often, which means that'll lead to higher greenhouse gas emissions, just due to the fact that we didn't invest enough upfront to make it resilient. So it's really making the case for why we need to build resiliently upfront. So the project itself began in 2016. We have $42.5 million over 5 years, ending in the coming March. So this is our final year of the project. There's over 30 different projects underneath the initiative. They're all coming to a close this year. All this is due to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And one question I want to answer is, why NRC? Why is the Research Council undertaking this work? Well, in partnership with Infrastructure Canada, NRC is taking this work for a few reasons. One is we have a lot of scientists in-house. We can work cross-discipline. We have our infrastructure and building scientists. We have hydrologists. We have aerospace specialists on aerodynamics. But additionally, we house the Model National Building Code. We don't write it. We help the committees to build or to form the building code and put the provisions in the building code, and we publish it. But we can't really march in there and say, make the building code more resilient. And one of the challenges to the project was, how can we work with these committees and come up with the information that's needed by these committees to make decisions that will make Canada more resilient? So we've come up with all the information and packaged it in such a way that it's prepared for those committees, and through code change requests, we can then hopefully make the codes more resilient. And that process is probably going to come through more in the next code cycle for 2025. We couldn't do the effort alone. We had to partner, of course, with Environment Climate Change Canada. They have all the historic data, but they also are experts on climate modeling and projection. So we work very closely with them. and also over 150 collaborators from right across the country. We have people from universities, we have climate scientists, we have materials manufacturers, we have municipalities, provinces, territories. So we have a whole bunch of different people all working on this project with us, and it's really fantastic. So the first result I'm going to tell you about is developing future climate design data. So the way we currently design our buildings and bridges is for historic data. So we look at what the climate has been over the past 30 years, we take the average, and we use that as a basis for how we're designing. In some cases, it's worse than others. In the Highway Bridge Design Code, which covers all the overpasses throughout the country, we're actually designing using data that was from the 70s, and actually 69, I think. It's even older than I am, from the 70s. And it, especially when it came to icing data and permafrost data. So the nice thing that we did as part of this project was update all the data we're using for bridges and buildings in this country to be the most recent data. So at least we're designing for the current state. We also decided to look at what Canada is going to look like and figure out how engineers can then use that information to design for it. Understanding that the future is uncertain, but something that we had to convince the climate scientists was that engineers aren't scared of uncertainty. This is what safety factors are for, load factors are for, because if you can tell us exactly how uncertain it is, we can tell you how much risk we would like to take on and decide how to design it. So this took quite an effort. We had our climate scientists, we had our engineers, all working together to develop this information. And I'm pleased to say that the report, of which this is a table of contents, is currently being translated, and we hope to publish it in the coming month or two. So that's an exciting output for our project. So this report tells us what the future of Canada looks like, and what the data will look like that you need to design bridges and buildings in this country, including temperature, precipitation and moisture, wind pressure, snow and ice. So all those 4 areas. Some of course are more certain than others. Temperature and precipitation are fairly more certain given the models, but things like wind pressures and snow and ice are much more uncertain. But the nice thing about the data, it actually gives you a level of uncertainty associated with that so that you can then design for it. So I'll give you a sample of the data here. So this is a sample of what the precipitation data looks like. So they've linked it to degrees of global warming. So for every degree the Earth warms, they have actually every half degree the Earth warms, they're showing how Canada is going to change for each of those variables: temperature, precipitation, etc. So in this case, we're looking at changes in precipitation on the left. So that's total precipitation. If for 1 degree global warming, going down, the next one down is 2 degrees global warming, the third one down is 3 degrees global warming. And on the right, we have changes in rain. So that excludes things such as snow, which we would have included on the left, for 1 degree of global warming, 2 degrees of global warming, and 3 degrees of global warming. So the nice thing of linking the data to global warming is it doesn't matter which scenario you choose. So it disconnects it from the concentration pathway scenarios and which greenhouse gas scenario we're following. So to be able to design infrastructure or buildings for changes in climate, you need to understand, or you need to decide how long you want something to last. So if I want, say if I wanted a roofing material to last 20 years, I need to design it for 20 years in the future. Whereas if I have a bridge that I want to last 100 years, I need to design it for 100 years in the future. So, and then we need to understand which pathway, or assume a pathway that we want to design for. So it can be anything from the best case scenario to the worst case scenario, in this case, RCP 8.5. And we've had those discussions with engineers. So for building materials such as shingles and things like that, it doesn't really matter which scenario you pick, because we're kind of baked in for the next 30 years. So all the scenarios look fairly similar for the next 30 years. When you start getting out to 50 years, they diverge further, and out 75, 100 years, they start to diverge a lot. So we had those conversations for materials. It doesn't matter that much. For buildings themselves, we expect them to last about 50 years. And they came up with the suggestion that we design for the worst case scenario. because there isn't as big a difference between the worst case and the best case. So the chances of over designing in this case are lessened. So we might as well go for the better case scenario. And also the cost of designing is not that great moving from one scenario to the other. Whereas when we look at bridges, they actually chose to go for a middle of the road scenario. Instead of designing for the worst case, they're looking at middle of the road. Also, there's the potential for being able to retrofit those systems as well as we move along the pathway here in 100 years to make those decisions on what we do next. Okay, so that's the climate data piece. It's a very big piece of the puzzle that now we can design our buildings and our infrastructure for future climate data. So moving on, I want to talk to you about some of the interesting tools and outputs we have from our project that are readily available now, and some that will be coming up by the end of the project. Someone's got an echo. So recently we published a suite of standards. We worked on 4 new standards, one on how to protect your basement from flooding, another one on how we design and build bioretention systems for stormwater retention, how we adapt wastewater treatment plants as well. So those are all new standards. We also talked with CSA and ULC and identified standards that were referenced in the building code and were in need of update to address climate change and climate considerations, including fenestration, which is windows, exterior insulation and finish systems, which is a type of insulated siding on the outside of a building, or insulated installation on the outside of a building. Fuel storage tanks was particularly interesting. They were concerned with how flooding might actually make storage tanks float away. So they worked on those to make sure that wouldn't happen. And same with buried tanks. They were worried about leaks or those tanks collapsing under the weight of floodwaters. Fire tests, understanding how materials needed to be aged before they were tested. So if the climate was going to be different, we wanted to represent that before we test them for fire. So a number of different standards were updated as part of that. And maybe the one that I find the most interesting, being a building scientist, is the CSA S478, which is a guideline on durability of buildings. So this is a guideline that's been referenced in the building code for many, many years because the building code didn't want to deal with durability. So they had it as a guideline in the appendix. So it's still there in the appendix, but we rewrote it as a standard, which means that it can now be used to regulate. So we can now regulate and ensure that our buildings and our materials last how long they need to last. And we'll be working with committees of the building code to bring that hopefully into the main body of the appendix in the next cycle of the code. So that even though it's just one line on the slide, it's a very important effort that we've accomplished. So other standards and guidelines, we've been working with Standards Council of Canada and Intact Center on flood resilient existing communities. An interesting one as well as the Canadian Electrical Code. They held a series of seminars right across this country to talk with the hydro companies, the stakeholders on the electrical code about what could be done for climate change, what they're seeing already, what some of those best practices were. And it was the first time for many of them that they started thinking about climate change, and it really got the ball rolling. And in the end, they formed some committees that came up with 50 proposals for change to the electrical code that have now been submitted and are going through the electrical code. So it's things such as how do we best build hydro poles in permafrost areas that are melting, for example. Other ones included just how you, by a building, if you have a drought, it can end up pulling on the wires and disconnecting them from the building. So how do you build in some slack in the wire to make sure that that doesn't happen, and all sorts of things along those lines. And the final one on this slide is about the National Master Specification. This is what we use when we go out to specify construction projects. They go to the Master Specification, pull the text they need and say, please build me this. So we're now able to build in climate resiliency into those specifications so that when we're doing procurement, we now are asking for things to be built with climate adaptation in mind. So now I'm going to speak about a few of the other projects, including a few of the areas of flooding, wildfire, as well as some of the assets and what we've done there for buildings and infrastructure. So in the case of flooding, there's a lot of effort going on. We're looking, of course, at what can be done for stormwater systems to reduce, to design them better, also looking at green versus gray infrastructure when dealing with stormwater. When is it good to use one? Was it better to use the other? What's a good combination of both? The photo on this one is particularly interesting. This is a concept for a buoyant foundation. So basically, if you have a small building, such as a cottage or a small house, you build a flotation device underneath, and it goes up on the guide poles when the floodwaters come in, and the house then goes back down to the ground when the floodwaters recede, and making sure that nothing is damaged in the building. And so this is something that can be retrofit on an existing building or built new. And the nice thing about it is that it means that nothing is damaged inside the building when this happens. So this is a new technology. This is one that's being developed by Elizabeth English at the University of Waterloo. And so this was the very first prototype they built. This is an artist's rendition of it, but they did actually build this one on the campus at University of Waterloo. And this summer they're retrofitting an existing house in Quebec that's at risk of flooding. So it's an exciting technology. It's a new technology, not quite ready for everyone to use yet, but we're helping to move it forward. Something that we're working on that's hopefully going to affect everyone is guidelines for flood resilient buildings. So in Canada, we don't actually design for flooding. So in the building code, there's no provisions for flooding. It says you must consider all loads on the building. Like, it's sort of one of these catch-all lines that should mean you should consider flooding, but there's no guidance on how to do that. So we've been working with the Americans, who do this very well already, to develop guidance on, if I insist on building a building in a flood-prone area, this is how I need to do it. And so those guidance documents are going to come out at the end of this project in March. Also working on coastal flooding and risk assessment. How do we support the design of buildings and infrastructure, looking at things like sea level rise, storm surge, et cetera, and what some of the mitigation strategies might be around that. Okay. Moving from flooding to fire, two of the most costly disaster areas in this country. I believe flooding accounts for 9 out of 10 of the largest disasters over the past decade or so in Canada. Wildfire, of course, there was the Fort McMurray fire, which is one of the top disasters as well. So big numbers associated with these areas, and so a lot of interest in ensuring there's less impact on the economy. And those are just the measured damages that the insurance companies see. There's other damages to social costs, there's social costs, there's health costs, there's the uninsured costs as well, there's the costs to business. So there's a lot that happens when we do have a natural disaster in this country. So we brought together a team of experts across Canada on wildfire urban interface design, so the area between the building and the forest, and what can be done. And they developed a guideline on how to prevent or mitigate the spread of wildfire from the forest to the buildings. So this deals with understanding what the hazard and exposure are, including how climate change is going to affect the risk and the hazard. Also looking at what resources are available within the community and how you would design the community to help prevent the spread of wildfire. And then we also get down to the property. So what can be done for materials of the building, different maintenance, so how you clear out the brush around the building, how you design the landscaping to prevent the spread of wildfire, which is primarily actually from the embers that fly through the air, is one of the main reasons that wildfire catches. And additionally, planning and outreach. If we want people to retrofit existing buildings, we need outreach programs in place. So there's a section on that as well. So other areas of buildings aside from flooding and wildfire include overheating. This is something we don't always think about because it doesn't have the big price tag attached to it, but it does have very high cost on health. And often a lot of our more susceptible populations, such as the elderly, new immigrants, children, people with medical conditions, are more susceptible to overheating. So what we've done is try to understand how the body reacts to overheating, what indoor temperatures create conditions that are dangerous for those at-risk populations, what types of buildings are more prone to overheating, and what can be done to prevent that overheating. So out of that will come guidance on how to retrofit some existing buildings, how to identify existing buildings at risk of overheating, and also what can be done to mitigate it. And we'll also be proposing some code change requests to address overheating. In fact, the building code right now doesn't have any considerations for the cooling season, so for summer. So it would be a new area to be introducing in the building code. We've also looked at how the building envelope, the walls, and the roof respond to different weather conditions. So how wind-driven rain is going to affect the way we design the cladding of the buildings. And this particular picture is someone testing the wind uplift resistance of a roof. So we've helped develop this technology and develop guidance on how to commission roofs. The industry, the roofing industry said, you can tell us what the climate's going to look like. You can tell us, and we can design for it. But the problem is, if it's not installed correctly, how do we test so we actually get the performance we need? And so that's where this came in, this whole program of commissioning of the roof, both to ensure you get what you paid for when you build it, but also to check after a major storm event comes through to see whether you're going to be okay for the next major storm event or whether you need to do some retrofit at that point. Another area we're working in is guidance on adaptable housing in remote areas. So we're actually working with the First Nations Building Officials Association to develop guidance for housing that will include some of the information developed under this project for climate change adaptation. So that's going to address some of the local issues, especially northern issues in the design and build of housing. So moving from buildings to infrastructure, this is my last slide on the work we're doing currently, and I have a couple more to share with you on a few other things. So this is about improving new and existing infrastructure. So as mentioned, we're working on buildings, but also 4 major infrastructure areas, one of which is highway bridge design codes. Thousands of overpasses in this country are governed by those highway bridge design codes. We've updated the 2019 code that came out in November to include now the intent to design for resilience. It was a word that was never in there before. So now the intent is there. For 2025, we're now developing the full provisions on you want to design, you're going to design for the future climate, this is how you do it. So we're planning to include that, working with the committees in the 2025 Bridge Design Code. Also working on understanding how existing bridges are aging, different technologies like satellite monitoring of bridges to understand can we use those to detect if there might be a fault in the bridge and need to go out and inspect it. Different monitoring technologies as well. In the picture on this one, we have pervious concrete pavement is the top picture there. There's pervious on the left and normal on the right. And what pervious pavement does is it allows water through and helps to mitigate, say, stormwater during urban flooding. So you'd pave a whole parking lot in that. So we've come up with standardized methods to evaluate it to make sure it's performing properly. We've also looked at some of the issues in the Canadian climate when we start to get salt on it, for example, how that can affect it, freeze thaw, that we have a lot of it here in Ottawa, how that can affect pervious concrete as well. On the rail side of things, we're working with Via Rail and instrumenting a set of rails near Smiths Falls, which is what you see in the picture at the bottom there. And this is to understand how freeze-thaw cycles are affecting the tracks and the infrastructure and really the ride quality over those rails. And when we first undertook the project, we spoke with some of the urban transit associations in Canada, and one of the biggest issues they said was freeze-thaw cycles. They said they used to be able to go out in the spring when everything thawed and inspect the tracks for any issues, and away they went. But now they were finding that things were thawing over and over again, and so they had to do more and more inspections of their tracks, and they're seeing a lot of impact from freeze-thaw cycles. So that's something we were setting out to understand and help them with. We're working as well on roads to understand how pavement design will need to change in a changing climate. Again, freeze-thaw cycles is one of the major culprits there. So what needs to be done, additives into the pavement, for example, to help improve the way we design our roads. And ultimately as well, we're working on guidance for storm sewers, drainage, water supply systems, so how heat can affect the quality of the water and potentially different treatments that need to be done for different temperatures of water, and sanitary sewer systems and how that's going to change in climate as well. And the final area that I mentioned once before is on life cycle assessment. Again, we can't adapt without considering mitigation, and so it's important that we look at the whole puzzle and understand as we adapt what are the consequences of that on the greenhouse gases that will be emitted, throughout the life cycle of that asset, both to build it, to maintain it, to rehabilitate it, and ultimately to take it apart at the end, and also to use it while you're in the middle. So we've been looking at some case studies for bridges, for roads, for buildings, to understand, if I put the investment up front, am I going to see the results? Am I going to see improved greenhouse gas emissions, really to help justify investing for adaptation and resiliency up front, rather than having to rehabilitate throughout the lifetime of the asset. So I'll leave you with two more slides. One of them is what I call my pathway to enabling resiliency. And this is really from the standpoint of a scientist. So as we undertook this project, we did a gap analysis in the first year to understand what needed to be done. But then as we get closer to the end of the project, we're looking at where do we go from here and what needs to be done. So ultimately, by March, we'll have achieved a lot of work. There's been a lot going, as you see. And a lot of it's been to establish the foundational science that's needed to enable people to undertake adaptation and resiliency to climate change. So this includes understanding future climates, understanding how our buildings and our infrastructure are going to change and be impacted by climate change, and then taking that into guidance documents and tools such as standards and codes where possible. But this doesn't get us to enabling resiliency. At the end of the day, NRC doesn't want to be driving adaptation in this country. We want to get the tools and information in the hands of the practitioners who are going to use it and create a culture of adaptation in this country. So can we get to the point where people coming up in school are trained to consider future climate in everything they design, and that it's not an afterthought and not something we tack on the end? And in order to get there, we need to get those tools and partner with industry and others and professional organizations to get those tools and education materials out there to enable others to take on this battle of adaptation. And if we can succeed, then that's a real win. And really, if we get the opportunity, which I hope we do, to have a second phase of that project, we'll be looking to push that forward and partner with others to get them to take on this information and move forward. And the final slide I'm going to leave you with is some online resources that might be of interest to you. The first thing was the Canada's Changing Climate Report. That's available at this link here. I presented that at the start of the presentation. Another one is Canadian Centre for Climate Services. And this is a center where they're looking to be a portal for all information related to Canada's changing climate. So it deals with all sectors like forestry, agriculture, buildings, health. So they're looking to have all that information there. And there's also a call-in line if you're looking for something specific, and they can help guide you to the information you need. And this is, we're working with them now to create hopefully a buildings portal or an infrastructure portal to house all the information coming out of this project and other similar efforts within the federal government. The second one, or the third item down, is climatedata.ca. That's a resource that was built in partnership with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, which is all things climate data. So that's where you can go to look at how Canada's changing, and it has different mapped products that you can look at. Our website, the Climate Resilient Buildings and Core Public Infrastructure Initiative, is there with updates on our progress. Codes Canada, if you're interested in the building code, which is now my primary job, is working with the building code at the moment. But you're welcome to check out that link there. And if you have any questions around the code, I can answer those today as well. Standards Council of Canada is working on some standards in support of resiliency of infrastructure, especially in the north of the country. Our project dealt mainly with south of 60. However, SCC is dealing with a lot of the northern standards on adaptation. And finally, a link to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which is what enabled all this to happen. Okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne. We have two questions waiting, one from John Meyer and another from John Stone. I ask others to enter into chat if you have a question, but I would like to kick this off by thanking you on putting together this very informative presentation. My mind just swims at the amount of meetings and the people that you have to coordinate. The stakeholders are just enormous in this country. And of course, there's when you try and put the amount of wealth that's both invested in the past and is likely to be invested in the future, you're doing a very big job, and I tip my hat to you. One of the things that did pass through my mind when you were talking about fire is the very problems that California has had with regards to fires being initiated through the grid. And is that an issue anywhere in Canada? And do you address that in your work?
It wasn't something that came up so much in the conversations by the utility companies in Canada. Their major concern for fire cause was the one I mentioned, where buildings have connections that are too tight, and when drought comes, it pulls those wires out and can cause fires. Transmission lines were less of an issue. Primarily, one of their main concerns about transmission lines was actually ice. So ice storms and things like that, of course, in this country, and making sure that things are maintained and the tree line is maintained far enough away so it doesn't cause an issue. So fire less of a concern, ice more so, I would say.
Okay, John Meyer, do you have your comment?
Okay, sure, Marianne, thanks. That's really interesting, and I'll probably be coming back to you at another time with demo learning center concept. But anyway, fabulous work you're doing. I guess my first question is, do you have an inventory of the roofs in Canada that might be suitable currently for solar, to accommodate solar PV and hot water and hot air installation?
It's not the primary focus of our work. I'm not sure it would be. Natural Resources Canada would potentially have that information through the Office of Energy Efficiency. I'm not sure exactly where they're at. I know it's possible to do satellite cataloging now.
They brought it in the States, yeah. So in some regions, so yeah. Okay.
But one thing we're looking at is on the resiliency side is wind uplift of PV on the roofs.
Right.
So ensuring that they're suitable for wind. So that's an interesting area in terms of climate adaptation in that case.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. But okay, second question. When you're looking at these standards, you're looking at resilience of the building. Are you also looking at whether the building can be easily adapted, upgraded to generate, to both save energy, but also generate it? And that brings me to my second question. Have you looked at the suitability of areas for geothermal storage in Canada? I can pretty well guess your answer, but
Again, you're getting into NRCan territory, but I do come from the mitigation side of things, and technology, energy technologies for buildings was where we started out. So there seems to be more of a focus right now, if you think from the mitigation side, moving towards the adaptation side, but now coming together. So how do we address both together? And in terms of resiliency, it's something we didn't look at under the specific scope of this project, but there is also the resiliency of individual communities, individual houses when it comes to energy needs. And that's something I know there's a lot of research in the field with NRCan, again, Natural Resources Canada, as well as with a number of the universities in this country undertaking work in those areas.
Okay, good. Yeah, last question, simple. You looked at precipitation. It's going to increase overall. It looks like in Canada generally to a certain degree. But did you look at net aridity? Because I think we'll be getting our precipitation more in larger dumps with greater periods of drought in between. Does aridity play a factor in your calculations?
So, it certainly does. I mean, one of the challenges right now is that there isn't a lot of historic data in this country for precipitation, and where it is, it's limited to the certain stations in the country. So where they're located, and it doesn't always dump at the water doesn't always fall at the weather station, right? So we have a lack of statistical data and understanding the stochastic nature of the rain in this country is a challenge. We're working with Pacific Climate Impact Consortium to understand what can be done with the data that's available and the models that are available. But one of the important areas for the design of infrastructure, particularly stormwater systems, is the intensity, duration, frequency curves.
Right.
So we're trying to understand how, and this is what PCIC is undertaking, Pacific Climate Impact Consortium is undertaking, understanding how those IDF curves are going to change in future climates and how to adjust them, just for that reason, because you're not designing for the average, you're designing for, you know, what that 1 in 100 chance in the future is going to look like. And that's something that also gets dangerous, is when we call something a 1 in 100 year event. The nature of events in this country isn't stationary, it's changing. So that no longer has meaning. So we're trying to change the way we express it to, this has a chance, X chance of happening over the next 100 years or over the lifetime of the asset, the next 50 years. And so it's a different way of thinking, moving from what's in the mind right now of a lot of the homeowners, oh, this was a 1 in 100 year flood, we just had 2 of them in the last 3 years. It no longer has meaning. So it's how do we change the vocabulary? How do we develop different notions on how to design our buildings and infrastructure based on the risk that we'll see over the lifespan of the asset.
Okay, thank you. Next, John Stone, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is more of a comment than a question. I started to get involved in this field when I was at the National Research Council running the Bureau of International Relations, and the council decided then to look at climate change in regard to buildings and infrastructure and the like. I think that none of the people then could imagine the wealth of information and hard work and research that you presented today. It's really wonderful. I'm really encouraged by it. And I think the timing is excellent. I made 2 comments that the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society Congress this year was done virtually, and on Monday we had a day's series of presentations exactly on the research behind this infrastructure and the like. And the other point I was going to make was there's a Zoom event this tomorrow afternoon, I think, with Minister McKenna in the context of rebuilding after the pandemic. So my sense is the timing of all this is coming together wonderfully well. If I may just add a small question though, I was involved in writing a report on infrastructure and climate change in the Arctic some years ago for the National Round Table, and one of the things that came up, which was a surprise to me, was the importance of the variability of climate, particularly temperature and snow and ice, that it goes up and down very much more rapidly than it used to, and that variance adds further stress and strain to the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I mean, and you're right. There were 2 presentations at CMOS, I believe, one by Environment Canada, one from NRC, on the work that's ongoing behind this effort. And as you mentioned, there's always a time and a place for everything. So great ideas a while ago finally find their footing and their place, and the stars align and someone invests in it, and we can make giant leaps forward. And that's something that happened here in Canada, that we're able to move this area forward. And it's not something that we've seen elsewhere in the world right now. And we've been working with the Americans, New Zealand, Australia, and others to look at climate adaptation of buildings. And because of this effort and this opportunity, we're ahead of those other countries. So we're hoping, as I say, in light of COVID, there's a lot of things up in the air, but we feel that resiliency is an important one. If we're going to be investing in infrastructure moving forward, if we're going to be investing in the economy, to do it right, and so it lasts. And so looking at how do we get this guidance out into the hands of people who are now going to be undertaking some very large infrastructure projects in this country.
No, it's good. Can you say something about the question I asked about the variance and variability of temperature extremes
Sure.
going up and down? But is this still true?
Of course it's very true, especially in the aging of materials, the durability of materials and the aging of materials, and something we see, like if you look at a roofing material, for example, it's in the summer it can go upwards of 80 degrees Celsius. In the winter it dives down to -30, and it's the cycles that end up wearing it out ultimately.
Exactly.
And it's something we see more readily. Like it's something we see for roads very obviously when we see so many potholes. and one of the challenges, of course, when we do those fluctuations and we're passing over that freezing point, it can do even more damage.
Right,
and it's something that we're looking at, like cementitious products. We're looking at asphalt design as well, and how it's going to react to those temperature extremes and the cycling of the temperature extremes.
Okay, there's three other questions: David Pollock, Susha Mann, and John Legg. And David, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. Excellent presentation, much appreciated. I just wanted to ask two questions from your presentation. The one is, I know it's not part of the job of NRC to do sort of the cost estimates when the core research is being done, but did you hear any discussion about the cost of creating one of those floating structures for a small house? That was my first question, and whether it will be in the realm of affordability versus somebody then instead saying, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to move further inland.
So I'll answer that one first and come back to you. So the researcher at Waterloo, Elizabeth English, her primary goal is to make it affordable. So
Okay.
she's looking at different types of flotation technologies like foam blocks, et cetera, and how it will react in a Canadian climate. Because that's one of the challenges, if this is sitting in ice, will it be okay, and how long will it last? So, but her goal is to make it affordable for people who can't afford to move and don't want to move. And so that's one of her very high goals in this area. Of course, she also has to make it safe, and durable.
Right. Yeah.
But it is a new technology. It's one that was used in Louisiana, first of all.
Yes.
She has various projects as well. I believe in Cambodia is where she's also working with communities there, but they don't have the same freezing issues that we have here.
Right.
So we're helping to move her forward, but that is one of the goals, to keep it low.
Good.
And in terms of not looking at costs, we did an economic assessment as well to look at if we implement the guidance on wildfire urban interface, for example, how much will that cost up front and how much will it return? And in all cases, it's upwards of 4-to-1 return on the investment. But it's challenging to get people to invest in adaptation because everybody thinks, oh, it's never going to hit me. And if it doesn't hit you, you think it was a poor investment. Right. So who's going to foot the bill up front? And that's
who's for more life insurance, right?
Yeah. So that's where it's an interesting dynamic, especially like on the energy side, you got the gas companies and the electrical companies to help foot the bill for retrofits. On the risk side, on the adaptation side, we're looking towards the insurance companies to see what type of programs or incentives they might be able to put in place.
And the second question, thank you for that first. The second one was when you were talking about different studies, and you said some would take the extremes of climate change as a projection to do their modeling, and then you mentioned bridges, and you said something about they had taken the middle level, and I was just interested in what would lead to that kind of choice as opposed to planning for an extreme.
So they chose the RCP6. Again, it's how much risk they're willing to take on for how much cost.
Sorry, who is they? Who is they that you're referencing?
We're working with the CSA and their committees that work on the Canadian Highway Bridge Design Code, as well as engineers that they've hired to help develop these provisions. So where they settled was, I think, RCP 6 as opposed to 8.5 or any of the lower ones. And the reasoning behind that was when we get out to the 100-year point, you end up with a lot of variation between those scenarios. And I think they felt that taking the higher road would hopefully be overestimating the need at that point. And it's something as well, though, that bridge design can be revisited along the lifetime of it and the lifespan of it as we get clearer ideas of where we're headed as well. So I think that was the logic behind it. There's a big fear in the industry of over designing. You know, we don't all want to be building castles and the cost associated with that. So there's also the look at, can we design for adaptation? So, you know, build something in so that we're able to raise up the level as if flooding becomes an issue, or build something in where it's easy to retrofit or easy to fix along the way. So I think this is one of the reasons behind why they chose that scenario.
So you're saying, just so I understand, that the design of bridges today would be such that even after they were built, if they found that they were wrong in their initial assumptions, that they could strengthen the materials after that infrastructure had been built?
That would be the hope.
Yeah. Okay.
Again,
I wasn't aware that that was a real possibility. Yep.
Well,
Thank
it
you
is
very
with
much.
things like fiber reinforced polymers and things like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, our next question is from Susha Man. Go ahead, Susha.
Thank you. Marianne, very nice presentation, really enjoyed. I chair a sustainability symposium here in Ottawa for professional engineers. I'd love to have you invigorate engineers here at our next seminar symposium.
I'd be happy to, just let me know.
Thank you. So first question is, in Calgary, we had people's windows breaking last week and roofs. So how does that fit in with the climate change design?
So that's the durability of materials. So that type of thing, like the siding, the windows, the impact of the hail is governed by the standards for those materials. And there is more of a momentum now in this country for designers to want to design more durably. But again, do you design for golf ball size hail everywhere in the country? Maybe not. So one of the challenges right now is, again, balancing all those factors, the positives, the minuses of designing for that, and how much risk you're willing to take. But the challenge right now is to understand what is the risk currently. And it's difficult because, again, these climate models can't model convection, or they can only model convection in a small area. So we can't look at how convective cells like that one might be impacted across the country. So it's hard to predict, you know, how likely is this to occur again? And even historically, it's difficult to know when has that occurred. And, you know, if there was nothing there to capture the moment and there was no one there, you can't tell that it happened. So they used to say, like, tornadoes follow the highways because that's where people saw them, right? So you're not capturing all the events that are there. So we're actually working again with some of the Americans to understand what tornadoes we're missing in this country, and really what historically we've seen before we can start predicting what the future risk might be. So there's still a big question mark over the connection between that type of storm and climate change, and then how it's going to be impacted. In theory, there's more energy in the air, there's more moisture in the air, so potential to have larger storms. But again, where and when they will occur is a big question. So it's possible, it's always possible to design above and beyond what's in the standards in the building code. So anyone's allowed to, but it's a question, you know, do we need to raise the bar? And in order to do so, we need the evidence to be able to convince people to do it.
Okay,
So can I still ask another?
Go ahead.
So I presume our present design is more like 100 miles per hour or 100 kilometer per hour for the residential homes, right?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with those specific standards. We were dealing mainly with the building code, which didn't deal with impact. So I'm not sure.
Okay.
But there's design values for wind and wind-driven rain, but not hail in that instance.
So my question was really, is there any thought given nowadays for residential properties or homes where we could, in addition to the solar, we could possibly consider putting a small turbine on each home, which would satisfy the noise and safety factor for residential purpose?
So you think of a wind generation for
Right.
buildings?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I used to work at the Canadian Center for Housing Technology, where we looked at all sorts of different types of technology. And at one point we were considering bringing in wind turbine, but the challenge is getting the right conditions for the area, and meeting those conditions is difficult, especially in neighborhoods, to know what the local conditions of the wind at that location on the building are. I know for the work we were looking at in Ottawa, it didn't make sense, but there's potentially other locations I'm not familiar with the technologies currently, but potentially where it would make sense would be northern locations with wide open exposure, locations by lakes that see wind, ocean locations. So those would all make potentially more sense. But again, I'm not familiar with this specific technology.
Okay, let's move on. The next one is John Legg. Go ahead, John.
Congratulations on that excellent presentation, Marianne. As originally a Quebecer, my interest often goes towards federal-provincial squabbles. And I wonder how the NRC, which I have always viewed as a jewel, and therefore could be, how should I say, other provinces may have ambitions in that regard to try to at least profit from all this knowledge and even somehow get involved. Could you say a word about federal provincial aspects, please?
I can. I'm currently involved right now in quite a bit of provincial and territorial and federal work on the area of building codes, so I can definitely speak towards that. Currently, the way the building code is developed is the federal government with its, well, we help the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes develop the code, which becomes a federal model code. So then at that point, the only people that need to use it are federal bodies. So anyone building a building for the federal government has to use that code. However, provinces and territories then adopt the code in part or in whole, add their own provisions or variations, and then they use that for regulation. So that's how it is now. But right now we're undergoing a process with the provinces and territories as part of a recent free trade agreement and reconciliation action to try to reduce the variation of codes across the country. And so all the provinces and territories have endorsed it, and some of them are signing. Some of them are signing. We're in the process of getting there, and agreed to adopt the building code within 24 months of it being published, the next version, and to reduce the number of variations between their own codes and the building code. So, someone needs to mute. So, not sure. Are we safe? Okay. So, so they're trying to reduce the variations between the provinces and territories. So this is quite complex, and now that we're trying to get them all to do this, they're identifying what variations they have, they're agreeing to try to reduce them, but we're also setting up, we're revisiting the governance of the whole code system. So I'm involved in the stakeholder consultation around the governance to try to make sure that the policies of the provinces and territories are reflected in the codes so that they then can adopt them with very little variation. So this is probably the biggest change to the code system in over 30 years is currently happening. And the ultimate goal is to reduce those trade barriers and the differences between provinces to make it easier for industry and practitioners to practice right across the country. But it is a huge challenge, I must say. But that is going on, and it will mean, hopefully, that then big policy issues such as climate change adaptation, mitigation, accessibility can be brought to the table by the provinces and territories, and they can then tell the codes to work on those issues. Because currently there is no platform that enables that. So keep an eye on it. It's supposed to all happen by December 2021. Right now we're working on the bits and the pieces to make it happen. So.
Thank you, Marianne. That's excellent news. I'm delighted to hear that, and I'd like to see some of that even trickle down to the municipalities. Mary Hagan is next. Mary?
Yes, thank you, Marianne. This has been exciting right up to the last comment just from Art now. I work more in the field of non-government organizations, community, stakeholder groups, and a lot of your research and findings are just terribly exciting, except we don't know about it. And secondly, I suspect even as you try to sort out codes between the feds and the provinces and what is doable, what is affordable, et cetera, the level of engagement from the public, I would be most interested in. In terms of guidelines, and you talked about a number of excellent guidelines, are there guidelines for consumer and taxpayers using the climate lens?
Okay.
We end up, we have to pay for it either through our taxes or purchasing, and we are often told there's no money, it's unaffordable, it's not doable, it's in an ideal world all very nice, and we don't know anything about all the background work that has been going on.
Mm-hmm.
Could you help me on that part of the project? I think Elizabeth English touched upon it in some of her interests and goals throughout the whole project.
So the main goal right now of the project was on core public infrastructure. So it wasn't to look at the individual building, like individual homeowners or building owners. It was mainly in the government interest. However, of course, there's applicability elsewhere. So something we're hoping for the next phase is to look at the needs of small communities and how to meet them, as well as the needs of individuals. And I'll tell you some of the pieces of the puzzle that I think need to happen next. So one of them is, how do we enable small communities to adapt? And currently, if you want to do any adaptation project, you need to bring, the main one is called PIVC, is the protocol. You need to bring together a group of consultants and experts together in a room to identify what the risks are for your project. And this is pretty prohibitive if you're a smaller community or don't have a lot of resources to do this. So what we're looking for in the next phase is to develop specific tools that are easy to use, quantitative science-based tools that will help people do a first pass risk assessment. So that's one area that we're looking towards helping develop. Another one is to talk to remote communities, indigenous communities, identify what their specific needs are and how we can help translate our knowledge to help them. And a third area is on understanding what can be done for certification. So how can we now take the guidance and the standards and the documents and help both industry develop products that can meet the needs of adaptation, but also develop certification systems that you can then say, okay, this is certified for use up to this wind load, or this is certified for use in, it's a flood resistant material, you can use it in basement construction. So how can we close that loop, both to help industry generate a market for their products, both here and internationally, but also help consumers make the right choices. So this is where I'd like to see us go. As I say, there's no commitment yet, but I think those are important steps to move forward.
Thank you. Wonderful.
John, Art, you're muted.
Art, you're muted.
I'm muted.
The silence,
Oh, there we go. John Hollins, you go ahead. You're on.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I thoroughly enjoyed that as well. And my question has really already been answered because John Legg posed it for me, but I will add a wrinkle. you mentioned, I think, that the meteorological data in the code for bridges was from 1970, 1969. That reminded me that the province of Quebec built Highway 19 in Laval in 1970. And that bridge, you will remember, collapsed in 2006. Approximately 1/2 of the way into its expected lifespan, which made me wonder whether the province of Quebec even knew about national building codes covering highways. And I'll ask you just to perhaps comment on that as well. But before I do that, I want to show you a cartoon that the Renewable Energy Resources branch commissioned when Phil Cockshut and I and some others were developing the first federal program in renewable energy. We, of course, had to deal with federal, provincial people, and this was the cartoon that we put on one of our pieces. If you can see, can you see my cartoon?
I think they should be hugging, no? Oh, dear.
Okay, is there a comment you'd like to make, Marianne, or should we move on?
What was the comment before the cartoon? Sorry, I got distracted and forgot.
It was a reference to the
bridge code. Yes, the bridges in Quebec.
Basically, I think a failure in construction in 1970 led to a collapse halfway through the anticipated lifespan of a 6-lane overpass in Laval.
Well, one of the challenges.
How the work that you do is actually picked up by the provinces, and do you think it's probably better now than it was 60 years ago?
Well, I like to think codes improve with time. I would hope, because that's the point of them, right? Is to make the necessary improvements as we go. But commenting on that bridge, a lot of things happen when there's a failure or a collapse, and it really takes the full forensic investigation to figure out why. And often, sometimes it's how it was built, how it was maintained. And so when it comes down to, does a failure trigger a code change, the committees need to look at all those factors of why did the failure happen in the first place. So not knowing that, I can't specifically comment on it. But another important thing is the technologies we have now to monitor and detect things before they fail. And when we say failure is not always a big giant collapse. A failure can be just the need to prevent something, or the need to be able to drive a 3-ton truck over a bridge and have it be okay, as opposed to having to reduce, no, now we only allow 1-ton trucks. So that in itself is a failure to perform how you need it to perform. So this is what we're trying to avoid, is to ensure that we're designing so that things perform the way we need them to for their entire lifespan. But also we're working on the technologies that let us detect and monitor and understand how the current climate is affecting those assets, and identify needs for repair before we even get to that point.
Okay, next we have John Stone, Dave Doherty, and Susan Tanner. John, do you want to go ahead?
No, not really. I just was making a note that this idea of floating buildings has been tried in the Netherlands. You must know about that, Marianne.
I do know about that one. This particular researcher, she showed me some of the pictures. She's an architect, and she was showing me how some of those ones are actually designed where it's like a foundation within a foundation. It floats up almost like a boat. And what I found interesting, I saw someone from the Netherlands present, and he was a very fascinating person. He was presenting at a catastrophic loss insurance conference, I think it was about. And he was saying in the Netherlands, they have to learn to live with the water. Whereas here we build the basements and expect them to stay tight and water never get in. There they design for the fact that the water will get in, and you just deal with it. So, but you don't use materials that are going to cause mold and things like that. So it's a very different way of thinking. And one thing that stuck to me was one quote he said was, if we fail to adapt, we die today. If we fail to mitigate, we die tomorrow. And I think that's something we all have to think about when we're in this space.
Okay, the next question is from David Doherty. David, you're muted. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. So somebody asked a question about putting wind generators on individual houses. And I thought your answer was really good. But it seems to me a much better way to deal with providing electricity to subdivisions, if you wanted to go the microgrid way, is to have single large efficient generators properly sited that could feed all of the houses in a subdivision rather than having individual turbines on each house.
No, I agree. Microgrids are also an interesting one. Again, it's the economy of scale, right? When we get too big, you lose the resiliency of having things there. But I haven't done the research, but I'm sure there's a certain size of community that makes sense for different generating technologies.
There was a great article probably 35 years ago, I would think, in Scientific American about how the electricity grid of the future was going to have to be distributed, and it had a sort of typical, we were talking about Holland a few minutes ago, typical flat farmland landscape with all kinds of houses distributed across it and with periodic generators. Exactly what they were thinking was probably going to be the way of the future.
I'm just delighted you brought up DERs and microgrids. I've been living in one for 3 years. Anyway, yeah, the next question is from Susan Tanner. Susan?
Hi, thank you so much for that, Marianne. It was excellent. I'm involved in a project at the Unitarian Church where they're thinking of developing a site which is a little bit too close to the river, but and a few other factors. And we were wondering, how would we access the expertise to get a climate assessment? Is that possible at this point? Or are there people that we could...
There are companies and people who have that expertise. A good place to start is the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. They have a phone number you can call and ask, and they'll put you in touch with the right experts.
Great.
Oh. All right, we have a question from Irene. Irene, go ahead.
It's actually a comment. In February of this year, the NCC hosted a presentation by Dan Sandink of Western University, where they're doing a lot of research on catastrophic failure of homes. And he mentioned, of course, 6 tornadoes in the west of Ottawa. Very good document was produced that I've put in the chat. And just like to say that February, we were all able to cram in one room, have coffee together, have discussions. That was a great time. But anyway, he was very knowledgeable about shingles and roofing issues. And this document that I've indicated in the chat has got a lot of good pictures and comments about home construction or building construction.
That's true. Dan and I are around the same table many times throughout the year, when we're allowed to sit around the same table. But he's with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and they've been working very closely with the Canadian Wood Council. I think that's the document you probably have shared. I don't have my chat open. But that document was prepared and looks at, you know, what can be done to prevent roofs from blowing off. So it's very well done, very well prepared as well. But it's great to work with Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. They do work as well on flooding with us as well, practical guidance on then how to prevent floods in communities and basements. So they've been a very good partner on our project.
Okay, I have a question. There's no more questions in the chat room there. So if folks want to have another question before we let Marianne go, please get them in. My question to you, Marianne, is the access to your report, when that is finished translating, can the public have copies of it, and could we get it for our website?
Yeah, so definitely we can send you the link once it's available, and you're welcome to connect to it. We're hoping to post everything on our website at the CRBCPI one with Infrastructure Canada. We're going to have links there. There's a gap report of the analysis we did in the first year that we're going to post there. But again, we're a bit slow at getting things up at times, but I believe there's going to be a website update in the coming month or so. So hopefully there'll be information there.
Okay.
I'll send you the links. I'll send Dad the link too. There you go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, we have no further comments. Unless Mary, you seem to be moving like you have something to add. No, no. Okay.
Art, I do. This is Gabriella.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Marianne, I just have a quick question. I joined in a little bit late, so I'm not sure if I missed maybe a point that you might have made. This is codes and standards. Do you work with countries like Norway, Sweden, countries that have similar, or maybe Russia, I don't know, that have similar weather like us?
So there's a few areas we're looking at international collaborations. The focus was primarily on Canada, but there's the area we're working on building codes with some of the other similar building codes in the States, in New Zealand and Australia. Australia is probably the closest one to ours. So
Australia?
Yes, because they're another confederated country. So their building code's quite similar in the way it operates to ours. So we're working closely with them as well on sharing best practices on the building side. In terms of building material durability, there's a lot of partnerships with ISO, with Europe as well. Talk about well, there is actually, so we put a collaboration in place with some of the northern countries to look at durability of building envelopes. Wildfire, there's a strong ISO work that we're connected to. There's also disaster mitigation network for infrastructure that's developing through the UN and India that we're sort of tangential to, but we're not associated with currently. But there's a lot of action in that space, and I find we're at the forefront, which is a good place to be, but also a lot of demand for knowing what we're up to and getting the information out. So we try to get involved as we can, but as I say, I didn't mention how many researchers we have on this, but we have over 100 researchers on the project, not full-time, but in parts here and there. So there's a lot of people and a lot of connections being made, as well as international conferences.
Excellent. And I'd like to ask Ted Manning to be our final speaker, and thank you for your presentation. Ted?
Well, I'm just really proud. But she's done well enough that she doesn't need any further help from me. And I thought the questions were very pertinent, and she could go on for hours. So I'd like to say thank folks for all coming up. These things are scheduled to let people who know something actually tell us something we didn't know, and it succeeded marvelously. So thanks lots.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Marianne.